Hey guys, this is the fifth installment in my poorly titled and hastily assembled project, Kingly Endeavors, in which I intend to read all of Stephen King's novels in chronological order. Last week, technically, I was supposed to be done with The Stand, which finally I'm done with now. It's 1,100 pages. I'm going to try to get through the summary really quickly, and then we'll move on to talking about something else. The Stand is about a superflu, which is colloquially referred to as Captain Trips. It escapes from some sort of government testing facility, and it kills, I read this on Wikipedia, and excuse me for taking information from Wikipedia, 99.4% of the world population is killed by Captain Trips. Initially, you think it's just a small band of survivors, but it turns out to be thousands. It's just that they're scattered all over the world. The first half of the book is them just surviving the flu. They just have this inexplicable immunity. And then at around the halfway point, they all start to converge in, I forget which state, but they converge on the farmland of a woman who I think is 118 or 112 years old. Her name is Mother Abigail, and she's sort of like this Christ figure who unites everyone. And of course, in a book where there's a Christ figure, there's going to be an Antichrist figure, and The Stand is sort of championed as one of these great explorations of good versus evil. So there's another guy named Randall Flagg, and he is like the Antichrist figure, and people are flocking to him because he's promising them sort of material goods. But yeah, so that's generally the summary. Anyways, one of the things that makes it really difficult to summarize, and I think that this is like a strength on the book's behalf. I heard this in an interview with Quentin Tarantino a long time ago. I forget what movie he was promoting or what movies he was citing as an example of this, but he was talking about plot. And if you're trying to sell a story that you've written, you really have to be able to pitch it. Pitch is like a succinct, 3 or 4 line summary of what your movie is about. Maybe not necessarily what happens, but what it's about. Say, for example, the pitch for his first novel, Carrie, which is very slim and simple, would be a bunch of teenagers torment this girl, Carrie White. Carrie White finds out that she has telekinetic powers, and then when they humiliate her at prom, she employs some awful, grisly revenge on all of them. That's a cool pitch for a horror novel. But what Tarantino was suggesting is that the great stories are, they don't really lend themselves to that sort of distillation. He said that with a lot of movies today, it's like a scenario is established, and then the whole movie is trying to live up to that scenario. The scenario, for example, will be a bunch of guys are trying to pull off a heist and break into a casino. Okay, and then the whole movie is about a bunch of guys trying to break into a casino. And that's fine. A very good movie, a very good novel could be, made up out of that premise. What Tarantino was really endorsing is the kind of story where it unfolds. I think a good example of this would be I think almost every episode of The Simpsons. If you watch the first 5 minutes of any given episode of The Simpsons, I think, and then you just skip and watch the last 5 minutes, you cannot conceive of how they got from these 5 minutes to this 5 minutes. Yeah. It's like a scenario was created in the beginning, and then that led to one thing, which led to another, which led to another, which led to the characters wanting something and pursuing something, and that becomes the substance of the story. Anyone watching this, though, who's seen any number of Tarantino movies knows that that is exactly how he tells his stories. You can't tell from the first 15 minutes of any given Tarantino movie what this movie is going to be about. So plot and story are kind of different things, is what I'm suggesting. As I understand it, and I might be wrong, please feel free to correct me, but my understanding of plot is kind of like the fulfillment of a scenario. Like the example of the heist movie, it's a bunch of guys living up to that plot of a bunch of guys trying to pull off a heist. A story, however, is different. Take, for example, if you were to tell me a story about the day that you had yesterday. It could be very much a story with a beginning and a middle and an end and a recognizable, distinct cast of characters, everything that a good story entails. And yet, there's no plot to it. So that's why I say that there is a plot, I think, to The Stand. There's so much going on that I kind of have a hard time discerning exactly what that plot is. But mostly it's just story. And thinking okay, this is a masterful story being told masterfully by a masterful storyteller. The word that comes to mind is masterpiece. I remember in college, I had a lot of classmates who thought that that word masterpiece is kind of antiquated and should be retired in the same way that the notion of the great American novel is kind of nonsensical. Even Jonathan Franzen suggests that the notion of the great American novel is really more of a journalistic construct, that reviewers talk about it, but authors never do, and really impassioned readers never really bring that shit up. But I do want to say that The Stand is a masterpiece. I don't know if it's Stephen King's masterpiece because he's written a lot, and this isn't even his largest work. It isn't even his most ambitious work. That's The Dark Tower, which is yet to come. In talking about a masterpiece, there are a number of issues that come up. On the one hand, there's that shit that my classmates would tell me in college, but we were just a bunch of pissy English majors who were averse to everything. There's this great book, I think it's just called Truffaut Hitchcock. It's Francois Truffaut having transcribed this 13-hour interview that he conducted with Alfred Hitchcock. In that interview, again, if I'm remembering this correctly, because I haven't looked in that book in a number of years, He talks to Hitchcock about everything that goes into making a good movie, and he asks Hitchcock, why did you never make an adaptation of Crime and Punishment? So apparently for several years, Hitchcock had been talking about how he thought Crime and Punishment was like the greatest novel, it was a masterpiece, and he wanted to make a masterful adaptation of it. What Hitchcock ended up saying is that, he was brainstorming about how to do the movie for a number of years, and then finally he just decided that it wouldn't quite work because, as he puts it, a masterpiece is a work of art that uses all of the resources within that medium. So conceivably, if not inevitably, a masterpiece of a novel won't translate into a masterpiece of a film. Of course, there are examples of masterful books that are made into masterful movies. The Godfather is probably the crowning example. Okay, so, as you can surely tell by the sun having gone down, this is several hours later, but anyways, we'll continue. Prefacing the point I'm about to make about why I think The Stand is a masterpiece of horror, I should also clarify that I really do think that this book is a horror novel. There's some ambiguity as to what makes horror, like what characterizes a movie as horror as opposed to like psychological thriller or whatever the fuck. And the same is often said of like science fiction. I remember having an argument in college with some friends about whether or not Inception was science fiction or psychological thriller, whatever. A lot of this stuff is just semantics. I say that The Stand is a horror novel, though, because apart from its obvious interest in gripping the reader and keeping the reader held firmly in suspense, it's also trying to unsettle you. There are a lot of very graphic scenes of violence there, and especially in the first half of the book, there are these grisly descriptions of kind of what happens to people's bodies as they're undergoing the flu. But I think that a trap that this sets up is like, okay, I'm going to say it's a horror novel and it's also a masterpiece, but then is there a difference between saying that something is empirically a masterpiece, like a masterpiece of literature, versus saying it's a good piece of literature, but it's a masterpiece of horror? I'm definitely guilty of tangling myself up in these arguments that probably seem totally asinine, but it's certainly something to argue with friends about. I think that The Stand is just a masterpiece overall, a masterpiece of storytelling, of literature, of horror, etc. And the reason I think that is because when I got to the end of this book, it didn't feel like it was made by a human being. It's a very weird thing to describe, but it feels like it was almost just sort of summoned into being by some celestial, all-seeing whatever. I don't know. Stephen King writes his books with the interest, it seems, of entertaining the reader. It seems like his foremost concern is entertainment, reeling you in, giving you a good time with the story. While King's intelligence is maybe not so blatant or readily apparent as the intelligence of, say, a Philip Roth or a Cormac McCarthy or whatever, someone who's sort of exploring really abstruse things on the surface of their text, his intelligence, when you think back on the book, is unbelievable. The scope of research and the scope of his imagination, like I have a hard time fathoming what Stephen King must have undergone in order to write this book. He talks about disease, he talks about weapons, he talks about war, he talks about religion, but none of his sort of, I guess you'd call it discourse on these things is like highbrow or it doesn't exclude you for the fact that you maybe haven't read the New Testament or whatever. It's totally embracing. It is so sprawling. And Stand, which I don't think is held in particularly high esteem as like a great literary novel, I think it achieves greatness because it's inspiring, it's frightening, it's very upsetting, it made me laugh a few times, and really what it really consummately conveyed to me, especially toward the end, is the endlessness of the human imagination. Stephen King does not shine the light on himself in any regard. I'm very pleased to say that none of the protagonists in this novel are novelists. He sort of ignites your excitement for what a writer can do. I don't know, it's almost kind of it's kind of embarrassing to be talking about this book because I feel like I'm relegated back to boyhood when I was just this totally earnest, overeager fan of things and just gushing. Overwhelmingly, by the end, I was just so taken aback by how fucking good he is as a storyteller. I was so obsessed with Stephen King when I was in middle school and then for the first part of high school, and then I started reading more highbrow things and whatever. And I think just because it was something that I enjoyed when I was younger, I have, as I've aged, just come to sort of dismiss his work. But no, this is fucking amazing. Another thing that I think is worth mentioning, though, about The Stand, or at least my reading of The Stand and what sort of lent to this other opinion that I have about it, I started reading The Stand the day after the recent attacks on Paris, which I think are about a month ago now. Consequently, reading all these passages about sort of the dissolution of America and how panic takes people over, and there's this insidious presence sort of lurking in the air, and nobody knows who's carrying it or where it's coming from, where it's going to strike next. All that stuff was particularly resonant in the wake of the Paris attacks. I was only 10 years old when the 9/11 attacks took place, so I don't think I really had the sort of social consciousness whereby I can attest to how people were behaving after those attacks. But from what I remember, I don't think people were as terrified to sort of walk out in the street or go to a shopping mall or see a movie as they are today. This isn't just as a result of the ISIS attacks, there's also all the mass shootings that have been going on in America lately. Maybe this is just a product of aging. I'm 24 now, and I'm certainly not a great sage as to what's going on in the world, but I am definitely more attuned to it than I ever was. The world just seems like a way scarier place than I ever thought it was, and I think the tenuousness of our safety and the fragility of human life is, I don't know if it's more apparent to the country than it's been in a long time, or if it's just to me, it's just a matter of me coming to age. I've never read this book before, so I don't know what it was like to read it in the 80s or the 90s or the aughts, whatever. I bought this edition of the book 10 years ago. It's been sitting on my shelf for 10 years. Had I read it in 2005, I'm sure it would have felt totally different. I probably still would have been disturbed in the places where I'm supposed to be disturbed. Would have laughed where I was supposed to laugh. I would have felt sort of an emotional churning when I was supposed to feel an emotional churn. But I don't think sort of this feeling of things falling apart would really have been so resonant as it was today. Yeah, as for this go-round that I'm having with Stephen King's work, as the fourth book that I've read in this project, it is definitely my favorite. It's the most violent, it's the funniest, it's the smartest, it's the most ambitious, and I think not only is it like a great crowning example of what books can do, if the subsequent 50 novels that he wrote, 50 novels that he wrote, were absolute, abject, worthless pieces of shit, on the merit of The Stand alone, he would still occupy a fucking throne of greatness in the realm of writers. That's an emphatic recommendation, so if you're a fan, I hope you'll pick it up. And if you pick it up, I hope you'll let me know what you think in the comments. Another thing before I go, since the last video and this video, I had a short story published in an online magazine called Pulp. The short story is called Cerberus, and it's about 3 pages. It's about a big dildo that ruins a relationship. There's a link in the description if you're interested. I hope you'll take a look. And yeah, so, Constant Reader, thanks for watching. Wait, no, that's not the last remark. I should also mention, since this is probably going to be the last video that I post in 2015, that my introduction to YouTube I was very reluctant to embark upon it, but now that I've done it, I'm so glad. This is like a message to anyone who's considering making a video. The BookTube community in particular is wonderfully embracing. They're saintly. They'll help you out, and my particular thanks to Katie at Chapter Stacks, who endorsed my channel, as well as to Emily Kate. I'll post links to both of their channels in the description. Yeah, my time on YouTube has put a terrific cap on 2015. So yeah, that being said, that's the end. So, Constant Reader, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in 2016.